It's now time for Q&A, and what I'd like you to do is if you have a question and you would like to ask an audio question, raise your hand on the bottom of the Zoom screen, and I will call on folks who have raised their hand. And also, if you have a question, you can put it into the Q&A, and I will read those out for Professor Banerjee. But while those questions are coming in, I just have a couple of questions here, Professor.
Go ahead.
You were touching on this at the end. You were talking about the reaction or the uptake by the political establishment. How does what you're learning square against political establishments around the world? Where is the political structure? Where are political structures that are actually interested in learning from your kind of research, and where is there resistance to doing so? Are there leaders of some countries that actually pay attention?
So I would say people who have to solve specific problems pay attention. So if who's doing research on UBI in the US? Well, it's the mayor of Stockton who needs to build a case that he to raise funds for the program he wants to do. So it's people who actually have a clear, well-defined stake in the answer. Those are people we find we can reach. That's true in the US, it's true in France, it's true in India, it's true in Kenya, it's true in Ghana. We worked in 87 countries, so it's we have a pretty wide experience in that, and I would say when we come to, let's say, the line ministry of education, we tell them, well, this is what we've been discovering about education in the last 10 years or 5 years. The reaction is not usually, oh, I know that, or this is not politically viable. The reaction is usually, I have no bandwidth. Can you come here and help me implement this? I'd be delighted to have as long as you can come and do the donkey work of implementing it. I'm delighted to have you do it. It makes perfect sense to me, but I don't have the bandwidth. That's the usual negative reaction. Is that not and that's obviously not. These are people who already agreed to talk to us, so they know a little bit what kind of people we are. We're sort of boringly technocratic people. We're not going to provide them with silver bullets. We also don't have bags of money to give them. So we have a particular clientele, but it's not a lack of. I certainly, in most countries, we get plenty of hearing. It's just then getting it to the next stage that sometimes we do succeed, but it takes a fair amount of effort.
Okay, and I have one more question for you here. Then we have several coming in, and I'll turn to those. But mine is this question is kind of about how you reach your audiences, which has a relevance to how journalists reach our audiences. You have a very powerful example in the opening of Poor Economics, in which you describe a study designed to test how much people would give to a charity depending on the message they received. If they received a message with lots of big numbers and talking about the millions of people that have food scarcity at that moment, there's one kind of uptake rate. But if they hear a message about one particular 7-year-old girl, more people will give more money.
Yeah.
So as journalists are writing about these issues, I mean, what works in reaching our audiences is so they can understand the situation? Is it the numbers and the stats, or is it the one compelling story?
I think that almost I would say both, in the sense that people do want to know that you have done the stats, but then they want to feel it. They want to feel that so when I tell the story, I'll tell you just to illustrate that. When I give a talk about the graduation program, which I talked about, where these people were given assets, the example that I often give is of of a woman of maybe 55 who's, 8 years before that or 7 years before that got included in the program. And she was telling her story. She said, look, I sell trinkets. Now, before that, I was a single mother who had been, abandoned by her husband, and then also abandoned by my son, who moved out with his. I had one child, and he moved out with his wife, and so I was begging, and I had never been. I never made a living for myself. What was really touching is that, they said, okay, so we will take you to, you just give you the money, you can go buy some trinkets and sell them. And she said, I don't know how to go buy trinkets. Where do I go? They said, okay, we'll take you. So they took her on a bus to the market. She bought some trinkets, came back. The next time, she said, well, I waited for that bus, but it never showed up. Turned out she couldn't read, so she didn't know that she was looking at the bus that looks exactly the same. So she couldn't go back. So they had to teach her how to read numbers before she could actually read the number of the bus, go figure out where to go. So it's at that story, I think. And then from now, she has actually bought a house, built a house, and her son has now decided that he loves his mother after all. And he's moved back with his wife, who she doesn't get along with. So she's about to build another house with her earnings so that she can now move out. These are huts in a village, but it's nonetheless a second hut so she can move out and not live with her daughter-in-law. So that's a story. I thought this story, whenever I've told this story, so people get a sense of where people are coming out of. And I think that's important. It's the texture of those things are important. And we have 1,000 stories. If you do this kind of work we do, which is often starting by doing a lot of field work, that's how you sort of decide, what kind of data to collect, how to organize the data collection, etc. You start by doing field work. And I've done field work in many countries, in Indonesia, in Ghana, in South Africa, in India, and it's a hugely important learning experience. But in that process, you pick up stories as well. And poor economics has a lot of those stories, in fact.
Okay, so let's take some questions from our viewers. We have an audio question from Hillary Bruck of Business Insider. Tyler, can you unmute Hillary?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Yep.
Great. I just wanted to ask kind of like a timely follow-up. You were talking a little bit about the US and welfare payments here, and I'm wondering if you could give a suggestion to Congress right now to help people in the US who've lost their income source during the pandemic. I'm curious because you talked a little bit about how money alone may not be the answer for people right now. So what do you think the best relief package right now would include in the US?
Well, I think that I'm glad you asked that, because I do think that right now, probably in the very short order, I don't think you can do much more than maybe protect people's jobs. So I wouldn't try. I mean, what a lot of European countries did was they basically froze the jobs by saying, look, we'll cover all payments. And the US did less of that. And I would say that's probably because it's in the middle of a pandemic is not the right time to think of a new design of a welfare program. Now, I think for the longer run, I was more saying that, something that's more sustaining and less I think, stigmatized is, I think, important, and one that thinks about livelihoods and people's lives rather than earnings is important. But I think that's not what I would try to do in the pandemic. I think the easiest thing to do in the pandemic is just protect jobs, and to some extent through the small business loans and through the welfare support. Some of that was done. It was sort of left maybe not fully completed, and that's what we're worried about, is that maybe it ended too early. But that's a I wouldn't say right now. I'm not proposing that we reinvent welfare. I think it's a more holding pattern till we get out of the pandemic. Then I think we were thinking about new ideas.
Okay. So we have a question from Stell Simonton of Youth Today, a publication based out of Atlanta. Can you give any examples of education programs for kids that have been effective in lessening poverty?
So I think that there's lots of evidence suggesting that, education, if you actually complete high school, earnings go up. I don't think that there is much doubt on that question. I think that so the evidence is the more difficult question is, in resource poor environments, how do you get people to complete high school or do the things that do boost their earnings? And there's lots of randomized controlled trials on that. A lot of the work we've done actually on that focuses on one particular issue, which is both an issue, I think, in many developing countries, but also in the US, which is this idea that teaching is often one size fits all. That you don't make distinctions among the kids, not this permanent distinctions, not tracking, but distinctions that say that, look, X is good at everything else, but is missing this particular issue. Y is very good at other things, but is actually hasn't grasped this thing. So identifying where they are and responding to that. There's now software that actually does that very effectively, which can sort of look at the mistakes you're making and identify where you missed something. So I think there is actually, and there's randomized controlled trials showing that software does improve learning levels very substantially, actually. So there's interesting work on that, but I don't think it's particularly expensive. It's just, it requires a mind reset to the idea that it's not a matter of, tracking versus no tracking. It's a question of, every kid has missed something, and you need to identify that and deal with that particular problem.
Okay. So I have a question here from Anna Wolf, a poverty reporter from Mississippi Today. Did you conduct any of the debunking the lazy myth studies that you talked about in the US? And what would you say is primarily different about poverty and the associated stigma in the US compared with poverty in the rest of the world?
So the one study, I didn't conduct it, but the study I mentioned by these economists at Yale is in the US. It looks at what happens when this additional welfare is approved in the US, and you basically see no labor supply response. Now, you might say that that's a bit special because, after all, people are this is special times. People are really scared of losing their jobs. But there's actually a bunch of studies like that, mostly not in the US, but in Europe, in many other countries, randomized controlled trials where people were given welfare payments that were not conditional on working or even looking for a job, for example, in Finland, and there's no evidence that people stop working when they get that.
Okay.
In fact, let me just add to that. The first, I think, large-scale policy experiment was an experiment in the U.S. on redesigning the tax system in the 1970s, and Daniel Moynihan pushed that through. If you remember that name. Pushed that through Congress, and that experiment found very small reductions in the labor supply, actually, when people got large transfers. This actually, we didn't do that. This was in the 1970s. I was still in high school, but.
Okay. All right. So I have a question here from Sandra Durek, a freelance journalist. Dr. Banerjee, you mentioned that prejudice stands in the way of political reform and that the media plays a role in shaping representation of poverty. What terms or language are we using that works against dismantling prejudicial ideas about poverty? So the words like corporate welfare is now used as a weapon against giving corporations tax breaks or handouts, which suggests the term welfare is part of the problem is in changing perception. So I guess big picture question here, are there terms that the media should or should not be using or should be avoiding to kind of convey the accuracy of the true understanding of poverty right now?
It's a beautiful question. To be honest, this is where I would say my expertise runs out. You probably have a better understanding of the power of words than I do. I agree with the fact that I try to avoid using the word welfare if I can, but I fall into that habit quite often. But I would call, one thing I want to emphasize is in our book, we very carefully avoid the word, when you write it's easier, word welfare. And we are much more, we want to emphasize that in a sense, a lot of what we call welfare is kind of the compensation for participating in an economy which has so much uncertainty. So that somebody in Washington decides whether there should be tariffs on this or not on that, whether soybeans to exports to China should be discouraged or not. And when that happens, the soybean farmer pays for it, but it's not that he never had much of a say on that. So I think that the idea that that the market economy creates enormous uncertainty and displacement, and therefore we owe people some compensation for participating in that economy. That it's not a matter of we are doing something for them, but that this is part of the infrastructure of a capitalist economy. I think that recognition is key. That we really need to sort of speak the language of this is part of any sustainable capitalist economy needs to have an infrastructure of social support. I think that's because that seems to me to be the only way you can possibly make it sustainable in the long run, because you can see that there's just so much of what, for example, this whole process of trade liberalization was, it was very clear that there were people who would lose out in that process, but we did nothing for them. We just let them lose out. Now, I gain from that because I'm a consumer of whatever Chinese exports, but somebody else lost his job. I gained a small amount, he lost a lot, but I didn't compensate him in any way. I think that the general idea that what we're trying to do is protect people from shocks that happen as a result of the willingness to participate in this market system. That idea needs to be put front and center, I would say. The exact words for it, you guys are better at it than I am.
Okay.
We write about this extensively in this book, Good Economics for Hard Times.
Okay. Question from Christine Rowe, a freelancer. Given how widespread vaccine hesitancy is, how feasible would it be to pay people to take the eventual COVID-19 vaccine? What does the evidence on conditional cash transfers suggest about the potential for scaling this up, including in high-income countries?
I think the answer is actually people are hesitant, but not. There are a lot of people who are hesitant, who won't do it because, well, is it really a good idea? I heard this other story, I read this story that maybe some vaccines make you sick. So a lot of people have mild uncertainties without really having a strong opposition. And there are people who have strong opposition. Those people would be expensive to convert. But there's a lot of people who are not, who just don't do it because, my cousin, he said this, I don't know whether I should do it. And we did a randomized control trial where we were told by all the local experts, this is in India, that people are not getting vaccinated because they have these deep beliefs against vaccines. We offered them 1 kilo of dried beans every time they got vaccinated, and the vaccination rate went up by 6 times. So, I'm less convinced that everybody has strong ideological views. A lot of people just don't do it because they don't do it. They want to, they're a bit worried. They think, okay, is this right? There's the trust in government right now is very low. All of those things are play into this, but I don't think that there is necessarily. I think a small reward for getting vaccinated will get a bunch of people in, and a bunch of people won't, but that might still get us to the point where we have enough herd immunity.
Okay. Question from Daniel Noor-Kior, a journalist in South Carolina. Undocumented workers face limited employment options and are easily exploited by employers in other ways, and their families are thus more likely to be poor. How can we reduce poverty in those situations?
It's a good question. I mean, I think my inclination is to say that I think given that they are not documented, the regulatory system is not going to reach them. I think you can't solve that problem in some ways without, I think 2 things work. One is getting, I think tighter labor markets always work, in the sense that when the labor market is tight, even undocumented workers are treated better. I think there is evidence for that. But in the end, I think the fact that undocumented is unfortunate. I think that there is, I think the US really has a very uncomfortable relationship with just how many immigrants it needs to keep the economy running at this point. And I think if we were more transparent about it, I think we would be in a better place to make policies. For example, one policy that would be, I think, maybe good for both the sending countries and the receiving countries is temporary migration, which a lot of countries do. You can come for 3 years and then you'll be documented and then you can go back, and that's going to mean that a lot more people will be able to come. I think those are programs that many countries run, and there is a case for it. Yeah.
Okay. Question from Ginny Bunch from North Carolina. Can you speak to how the need for childcare fits into the mix? Is it possible people are able to work more after receiving funds because they're able to pay for childcare?
So it's possible. And it's surely, and we've actually written about this as well. I think childcare is one of the things which make, especially women's lives and labor force participation extremely fragile. What do you do when your child is sick, for example? There's really no backup, even for people who have school-age children, and I think that makes particularly women's lives extremely fragile. I think many countries have both more generous leave. I mean, the US is really an outlier in terms of just how few days of leave you have. So I think even giving people more leave would make it easier, but also providing subsidized childcare, I think is an idea that even Ivanka Trump was supporting at some point. I think there's a strong case for it. Just that it would be a transfer that would target, I think, very well. It would target the vulnerable woman population, in particular single mothers. I think that's a population that surely one could justify helping more. Okay. And also make the labor force participation better. They would be, because they are would become more reliable workers, they'll do better in the labor force, they'll be more productive. I think the economy would gain and they would gain.
Okay, so we have time for a few more questions. I have one here from Catherine Myers. Dr. Banerjee, have you measured women's unpaid work in the home and counted its value? The global women's strike and women of color in the global women's strike has called on governments to provide care income.
We haven't, that's not sort of, I know people who do that. It's not what we do. We do randomized controlled trials. This is more, I think the work on, important work that is other people do. There are lots of economists who do that, which is work on how to make the idea that the GDP is kind of mismeasured because, for example, women's work is not counted. If a woman stops working and stays home because she's actually doing more useful things at home, that's counted as the GDP goes down. That seems backwards. So I think there's interesting work going on that. I'm not the world expert on that or even close, but I know people who do that for a living. It's just not what we do.
Okay. So we have just a few more minutes. Remember, if you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand and we'll give you the microphone. You can ask an audio question, or you can send in a question through the Q&A function. I do have a couple more questions while we're waiting for any final questions to come in. Your Nobel was awarded for introducing a new approach to obtaining reliable answers about the best ways to fight global poverty. That's the language from the committee. Randomized controlled trials. This is a very basic question, but why was that so new? I mean, randomized controlled trials have been used in medicine for a long time. Why had the economics field not really, paid attention to or done that before?
So I think it's an interesting question, and I mean, partly, it's often force of habit rather than anything else. So I don't want to say that there was a deep reason for not having done it. There were some, as I mentioned, one in, I think it was in New Jersey that they did this experiment on income transfers and what it did to labor supply. I mentioned that in the 1970s. Why did it get forgotten? Well, it was a lot of work, and what we got better at even before the randomized control trials, what I think in development economics in particular, we were doing a lot of field work. We're getting used to the idea of collecting our own data. So we created infrastructures already for going into places where most people wouldn't go, and somehow managed to collect data quite easily. And I think we learned a lot in that process. We had the confidence, at that point we had the confidence that, look, I had the confidence I could collect data. And that was important because, of course, when you do something like this, you're doing it in, 1,000 villages somewhere in the middle of nowhere in some country, and or 1,000. The people who studied, for example, voting in the suburbs of Paris, so like millions of people in these high rises around Paris. So, how do you collect data there? How do you, it takes some kind of set of skills to master that. And I think we had mastered that. And that was important. The set of skills that help you, go into somebody's house and persuade them to give you answers to your surveys and things like that. And so I think that was part of the learning that helped us in this.
Okay.
And now we're learning how to collect data online since we can't survey anymore because of the pandemic.
All right, so we have a follow-up audio question from Hillary Bruck of Business Insider. We'll get you unmuted, Hillary, and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hey, yeah, thanks for taking my question. I just had one more. Just to follow up on what you said during your presentation, you said it's critical that welfare be more generous and less demeaning. Coming from a US perspective, I'm just wondering what would that look like? Can you give some examples?
Yeah, I give the example that's, I think, it's an extreme example, but it's one that I think is actually very telling. It's in our book. In France, there is an organization called ATD Fourth World. What they do is they actually work with people who are sort of who are well, typically have mental illness or other deep problems, substance abuse, and who have sort of are so dysfunctional that they're often actually not able to access the welfare system very well. They sleep on the street. They don't have a place to be. They don't really know how to apply for welfare. And they work with these people, and what they do is they create enterprises with these people. Like, for example, trash handling enterprise or something where they get a contract from the city and handle trash. But one of the things they do is they treat it very much, the organizational culture is one of, so they, and this requires some effort of treating it like this is an organization of professionals. So they treat everybody like a professional, ask people their opinions, give them the space to express themselves. And what they find is over time, these people are able to go back to the labor market, that they regain confidence, and that they are able to join the labor market. They even start their own firms. So there is, I think that's an extreme example of taking people who are really sort of broken in some ways or the other. And really at that point, when most people would not even talk to them politely, to give them the respect of somebody who is a co-worker in a professional environment. And by doing that, they build up confidence. I give you another example. It's very interesting. In France, one of the things that they find is that a lot of the people who come, this is the kind of the public employment agency. They're trying to find jobs for people, and they find that people who come, they send them to these jobs. They don't love the jobs. They drop out. One of the things they're dealing with is that while unemployment is high, a lot of these people still drop out of the jobs. They just don't somehow find the jobs satisfying. So what they did was they brought these people in and said, look, we're not going to propose a job to you. Instead, we'll let you tell us what project you want to do. And they spent a couple of days just debriefing with them, listening to them about their hopes and desires and what they want to do. And they all came up with weird projects, it turned out. But interestingly, after they were debriefed, they're actually much more willing to go take a normal job and stay there, because they feel that then you're not just sending them somewhere because you have no understanding of their aspirations. When you actually listen to people, they actually think, okay, yes, she's sending me to this job. This is the best we can find right now. She understands who I am. She's willing to talk to me like a person. And that makes a very big difference. The labor market outcomes are very different. They're much more willing to hold on to those jobs, even if they're exactly the same jobs, but they end up happier with the jobs because somebody's actually not treating them like, okay, you're a problem, I'm solving that problem, but you're a person, I'm talking to you as a person. I think those are very different ways of dealing with the same issue.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have time for just a couple more questions. I have one here from Jill Sheridan of WFYI in Indianapolis. Have you done any studies about ways to end generational poverty, especially in segregated urban areas?
I have not. The generational work we've done, I was telling you a little bit about this the study of the graduation program, that we're going to follow them up now again. And we see that already the next generation is different now, that, as a result, the mothers were supported, as a result, the children are now much more likely to be working outside. They're more confident. They go out they're migrated to different places. They have different employment options. So you do see evidence of generational transmission. The children are now, they're between 15 and 20. We're going to go back in a year or two when they'll be 25 and see whether that still keeps going or not. But that's the closest thing to that to it that I've been involved with.
Okay.
And not in the US and not in urban environments. There may well be ongoing work on that in the US in our organization, but I've not been involved.
Okay, and I think this may be the last question, but I want you to step into the political environment. What are the top 3 things on the anti-poverty agenda you'd like to see a Biden or a Trump administration do? Now or within the first 100 days of their administration, for example. What are 3 things a new administration can do to alleviate poverty here?
The first thing I would say is there is this program called Trade Adjustment Allowance. It exists since the 1960s, I think, or 1970s. It's almost never used. But it's a program which is exactly designed for what I was saying, which is when you change the tariff on soybeans so that or whatever, that you ban the export of soybeans to China, you're going to get a bunch of people hurt. And the whole goal of the program was to identify who's going to get hurt and help them. This program is almost never used. It's for every county that's affected badly by trade, people get per head 23 cents, I think, from the program. So nothing. It's not, and yet it's not used because basically there's no political will behind it. But I think this is a classic example of what we should be doing much more of, which is identifying who's getting hurt for no fault of their own and helping them. So I think creating a broader infrastructure of, we have the information now. We know exactly if you put a tariff on this or you put an export ban on that, who's going to get hurt. We know where the farmers are, where the industries are. The furniture makers are in North Carolina, the soybean farmers are in Indiana, and we know exactly where they are. So in some sense, I think we could do much better than saying that, look, what can we do? They're all sort of, these are strings and arrows of outrageous fortune. It's not. They're predictable policy choices we make, and we would follow that up. So creating an infrastructure of identifying who's going to get hurt and finding ways to compensate them. I think changing the labeling, as we were discussing, from we are making you welfare payments because you're dumb enough to lose your job, to you lost your job because the government did something, and there's a pandemic, or it's not your fault, and we'll try to bail you out because it's our fault. So I think that general shift in mindset, I think, is critical. So I don't know whether that counts as 3 things or not, but that's sort of where I come out.